Pacing is one of those abstract concepts that, while it's hard to quantify, is incredibly important to keeping one's audience engaged. Any writer worth their salt will know how to keep their story interesting, when to focus on one character over another, or when it's time to lighten the mood, or when the plot should start wrapping things up. No one wants to sit through a story that feels like a slog, like it doesn't know what it wants to do. That's the reason why the 3-act structure is so predominant in pop culture. It's basically a guide on how to write an entertaining story. Video games take this one step further. On top of writing a compelling story, games also have to worry about keeping the actual gameplay engaging. If gamers are stuck doing the same thing over and over and over again, they're going to get bored. Look at how many people complain about grinding. Taking a core set of mechanics and using them in a variety of different ways is a huge part of making sure that players will actually want to keep playing. Even the smallest change of pace can end up making a huge difference. Which brings us to Metal Gear Solid 3: Snake Eater. Metal Gear Solid 3 is widely regarded as one of the greatest stealth action games ever made, and fans often cite it as the best entry in the franchise. Gameplay layered system after system on top of one another, creating this incredibly organic and responsive world that's still impressive over a decade later. Breaking away from the previous game's confusing, philosophical story gave director Hideo Kojima a chance to tell a more concise story while still rewarding the commitment of longtime fans. Everything, from the level design to the soundtrack to the boss fights, all of it was absolutely amazing. Speaking of boss fights, there's one in particular that stands out. In general, MGS3's boss battles are great. As one might expect, they do an exceptional job of breaking up the sneaking with some crazy over-the-top action sequences. But the end is unique. Unlike the close quarters combat of the game's other boss battles, the fight against the end is a long-range sniper duel spread out across an entire forest. It's a methodical, stealth-focused encounter. Gunfights and explosions are traded out for camouflage and long-range scopes. By ditching the action-heavy boss fight formula and instead focusing on survival and sneaking, the developers were able to create an encounter that subverted the standard gameplay while simultaneously acting as a true test of everything the player had learned up until that point. Needless to say, it is a fantastically designed encounter and easily one of the high points of the game. What comes next is, well, different. The change of pace is, to put it lightly, drastic. At first, being greeted with an empty corridor feels like a trap, but even after reaching the end of the hallway, nothing happens. There's no enemy presence at all. The only thing that stands between Snake and the path to Groznygrad is a simple ladder.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night. What a thrill. I'm searching and
There's something beautiful about the blatant ridiculousness of the ladder. The idea of having someone spend 2 full minutes doing nothing but climb a giant virtual ladder is absolutely preposterous. But at the same time, it works. It's a legitimately funny moment and a perfect example of the kind of humor that kept the series from collapsing under the weight of its own melodrama. Mostly. And it's worth noting how hard it can be to tell a good joke in a video game, much less telling one without relying on a cutscene or dialogue. But it's not just a joke either. Strange as it may seem, the ladder is more than another one of Kojima's bizarre gags. Look at it like this. Without the ladder, the game would immediately transition from the fight against the end to sneaking through the mountainside base. Both of these sections are lengthy, demanding, high-intensity stealth sequences that can last for nearly an hour each. And remember, staying hidden and or alive in Metal Gear Solid 3 means paying attention to guard routines, level design, environmental hazards, terrain, camouflage equipment, and a half dozen other variables all at the same time. Even for a game that's built around stealth, keeping track of all those different factors can be a lot to handle. Now imagine doing that non-stop for upwards of 2 hours without any sort of break whatsoever. It doesn't matter how big of a fan you are, that's going to get exhausting. That is why the ladder exists. It's a break. By inserting the climb between the fight with the end and the trek through the mountains, the developers took what would have been one massive, overly long stealth sequence and divided it up into 2 manageable sections. And because the climb temporarily ditches 99% of the game's mechanics, players get a chance to turn off their brains and relax for a few minutes. In a lot of ways, the ladder provides the same sort of break that's typically reserved for cutscenes. So, why isn't the ladder a cutscene? Well, first off, 2 minutes of gameplay is already pushing it, and watching Snake climb for that long with 0 input would be painful. More importantly, the joke relies on certain player expectations, namely that any sort of interactivity implies that something could happen. Even the smallest amount of control will ensure that whoever's playing is actively paying attention, just in case. It all adds up to a moment that is far more than the sum of its parts. The ladder is something of a paradox. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, nothing about this sequence should work. If anything, describing it in such detail makes the whole thing sound like a bunch of obnoxious filler, like the worst possible kind of intermission for an interactive experience. And yet, the ladder feels like an important part of Snake Eater. Back in its heyday, the original Kojima Productions was full of incredibly creative people, and it shows. The team took what could have been another fade to black transition between levels and instead produced one of the most memorable moments in a game that's already chock full of them. That may sound like a small thing, and it is. But finding a studio with that level of dedication that's willing to put the time and effort into even the smallest of touches, that can be hard to come by in today's industry. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, it's amazing to see what a truly talented dev team can pull off with just a ladder and a theme song. Thank you guys so much for watching. I figure it's been like 6 years since the first episode of Quiet Time. Why not do a second episode? That said, I really do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you want, you can go ahead, spread the video around on all that social media goodness, Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, any of that stuff. It really does help the channel grow. And speaking of helping the channel grow, I have launched a Patreon. So if you feel like helping support the channel that way, make sure to go to patreon.com/brokenbase. I am already working on my next project, like, I am actively working on it and editing it and all that fun stuff, so hopefully it won't be too long before you guys get to see that. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.